I'm going to talk about Aristotle and specifically about his theory of Pneuma. And I imagine this to be in a course on French spiritualism. And this would be early in the semester, investigating the ancient Greek influences on French spiritualism. And so what I wanted to do was a little bit on Aristotle and a little bit on the Stoics, but there's too much to say in Aristotle, and there's like a lot of really interesting stuff there. So I'm just going to do Aristotle, and I'll reference the Stoics a few times, but that would be what would come next. And then going into Ravison's interpretation of both Aristotle and the Stoics. So that's kind of the context of it. And it's going to be a bit condensed. I just really wanted to kind of touch on all of the interesting things. And normally in a class, I would unpack a lot more of this, but anyway, so that's a long preamble. Yeah, I think that this is really interesting for French spiritualism, and French spiritualism is really interesting because it is a non-dualistic way of understanding the relationship between nature and the soul. And for Aristotle and for the Greeks, Pneuma was this link that bridged the gap, well, at least the gap that modern philosophers saw between nature and the soul. But as we'll see, there wasn't really that gap in the Greeks in the same way. So Pneuma is the Greek word meaning spirit or breath. And it's a very subtle and profound notion in ancient Greek philosophy. The word was used in connection with many different aspects of life. It's a sort of crossroads for the physical, physiological, and psychical phenomena where they meet and mix. Pneuma also accounts for very subtle phenomena like intentionality, schematization, habituation, and the synergy of our senses working together. Many of Aristotle's insights were so profound and lasting that they were even adopted by 21st century phenomenologists like Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Aristotle's spiritualist philosophy would have a profound impact on post-Kantian philosophers in both Germany and France, Maimon, Hegel, Schelling, and in France, Maine de Biron, Ravison, and Bergson. The reason is that Aristotle approached life in a non-dualistic way that relied on observations of biological processes as well as inner states of consciousness. And as we'll see, Pneuma is essential to understanding the relation between body and soul. And what Aristotle has to say is very interesting because he provides an account of life that is non-reductionistic and non-dualistic. Drawing on Ken Wilber's terminology, it includes phenomenology, developmental structuralism, and even physical explanations. And it's something like an integrative concept, which brings together many very different manifestations of the same principle in order to understand its complexity. So Aristotle partially adopted his views on Pneuma from earlier sources. In the larger Greek context, Pneuma had both a religious and a medical sense, being a sort of divine activity in nature, the spirit of life, as well as an observable physiological force or process in the body, something that needs to be regulated by the medical arts. The word Pneuma, though, also refers to the winds in the sense of like regular wind patterns, things that bring rain or heat, things like that. And the winds with a capital W in Greek are called the anemoi. They are divine forces with intent, agency, and persona behind them. The four major anemoi were Boreas, the northern cold winter wind, Zephyrus, the west wind, which brings a mild spring or an early summer breeze, Notus, the south wind that brings storms in late summer, and Urus, the southeastern wind, which brings hot turbulent storms and crashes ships. And then there's also Aeolus, who was the quick-moving, nimble storm god, the keeper of the winds. He's the one who provided the winds that carried Odysseus back to Ithaca. And then there are many lesser winds beyond these as well. And to the Greeks, all the wind patterns had a sort of life to them, and they each had distinctive qualities and some connection to the divine. The Pneuma had quite a broad range of meanings as well, extending apart from this mythic context. The early Greeks did not make any hard divide between the inanimate natural world and the life of the soul. Nature was full of movement, and while some movements are chaotic and mechanical, these are much less essential to understanding nature. Nature was a source of self-movement, of growth, adaptability, and improvement. So the pneuma was able to be both natural and divine, and this presented no major conflict in the mind of an average Greek, nor even in the minds of Plato and Aristotle. And think also of how wind is both a palpable physical force causing movement and something invisible. It is air, but it's something more than air. It is the animation and strength of the wind. And this wind is not merely analogous to the soul, it's the same substance and being as the soul. And even though these physical explanations, which Aristotle gives, I'll talk about them in a minute, they're very rudimentary and imprecise and, proven wrong by now, but they're nevertheless drawn from direct observation. And these observations include both inner and outer sense, both the natural world and the life of the soul. This sort of proto-phenomenological aspect of Aristotle's philosophy will be revived many times in history. The Stoics make pneuma into a cosmological principle and base its basic conceptual structure on the structure of consciousness itself. The French spiritualist tradition adopted the dynamic spiritualism of Greek philosophy by adapting it to the advancements made in science at their time. And they did this with a view to amending the failures of 19th century science, specifically the failure to take consciousness and spirit seriously, and to use inner life as evidence to understand the nature of reality more generally. So if I had more time, I would get into more details with this and provide more quotations, but the ancient history prior to Plato and Aristotle is very rich in terminology relevant to this topic. So I'll just go briefly through these. We have thumos, which means spiritedness, heart, and force, this kind of self-preservation in life. Horme, which meant effort and an urge or to lunge, but it also means to consider, ponder, reckon. Orexis means desire, but Aristotle said in the beginning of the Metaphysics that everyone orgesthai, which is based on the word orexis, which means to stretch out towards or to desire knowledge. Everyone desires knowledge. So we can see there's this ambiguity in each of these terms already. They connect both to the body and to the mind. And now psyche, everybody's heard this in the psyche. In Homer, this meant life and soul, but it also had this sense of a cool breath or spirit. And for Aristotle, this becomes the primary animating principle of all living things. And all these terms clearly have a lot of overlap with pneuma. And lastly, I'll just mention tonos, which means tension or to stretch and tighten. And it also has many musical meanings, like the pitch of a sound or even the scale, the pattern of notes in a scale called a mode. And from this idea of mode and tonos, there was an ethical sense. We can think of attunement and temperament or tenor of one's character. So Aristotle kind of takes all of this ancient terminology and condenses it and gives us this term, which I think really touches on all of those ideas, which is energia, which is translated activity or being at work or operation. But it's a kind of activity of life that is intelligent and involves intentional action. Energia for Aristotle helps explain the unifying of plurality, and it's what gives unity to the organs of the body and to movements. And it's also how he describes sentience and attention. So pneuma has this really broad range of meanings. It can mean a physical force, vitality, sentience, feeling, also this kind of spiritual energy within the soul, and things like consciousness, effort, and thought. It has a very broad range of meanings. Again, it's a kind of crossroads between many different phenomena. So let me just say a couple things about Aristotle's idea of the soul. The soul for Aristotle is this simple, perfect, immovable principle that creates life and guides life. And it's something which imparts benefits on the body by ordering and improving the body and increasing its possible activities. It involves a kind of internal causality, and this internal causality of life and the soul is indispensable in all forms of life, including plants, which exhibit what he calls the nutritive activity of nourishment, digestion, and growth. Nature and life for Aristotle are seen as concrete internal principles of motion and change within the world. There's no duality between the dynamics of nature and those of spirit and soul. No doubt they are different, but it certainly isn't unimaginable to conceive of them in close relation or as forming a unity in embodied life. Psyche meant life, and while there was certainly a belief in the enduring life of the soul after death, there was no sense that the soul was alien to its embodiment. So these ideas were all systematized and clarified by Aristotle, and I think he did so without reducing their complexity. And he, in fact, enriched the phenomenological descriptions and further explained this developmental potential of the soul to rise from the physical into something more noble and intelligent. The self-caused activity of life in its simplest form manifest in vital heat present in the process of digestion as found in both plants and animals. It animates the living body, and the body must maintain an appropriate degree of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness if life is going to be preserved. And it's the heat and the moisture here which do most of the work. They are the active ingredients, as he says in his book, Meteorology. And when they mix and fuse in a specific proportionate way, they form the force and substance of pneuma. Pneuma is thus described in physical terms as a balanced mixture of heat and moisture. And in this way, it is more than matter, it's a process. It is often described as a sort of frothy, foaming, bubbling activity like what is found in fermentation and digestion. It's a developmental process rather than a stuff, a behavior more than a substrate. In hot, moist compounds, the process of concoction, as Aristotle calls it, transforms raw material into something organized and suitable to sustaining life. From the fact that all living things require concoction for digestion, Aristotle concludes that all ensouled things have heat, by which he means an inborn vital heat, which is internally balanced and sustained by this moist breath, pneuma. This idea is also found in the theories of the Hippocratic doctors, who thought that respiration was necessary to maintaining vital heat. The function of respiration, anapnoe, according to Aristotle, is to cool the excess of vital heat produced by digestion and circulated through the blood. Pneuma moderates and balances these natural forces in the body. And since it's this proportionality among the mixtures of the contraries, pneuma is something greater than the sum of its parts, an idea I'm going to come back to throughout the course of this lecture. In his text on sleeping and waking, Aristotle says that, quote, sense perception originates in the same part of the animal's body as movement, the region around the heart. And both movement and the guardian power of sense perception, kurios, which he also calls at other time the common sense, also originates there. In the movement of animals, Aristotle says that pneuma is the cause of mobility and strength in living in animal life. The pneuma is a force that moves the body, it directs and pilots the body, but it is not like the pilot of a ship who comes and goes from the ship. The pneuma is embedded concretely in the body. It is at home there and nearly fused to the whole body. Thus, the pneuma imparts a corporeal force, since it's a mixture of contraries, but at other times, Aristotle actually likened it to the stars, being more akin to the divine, ethereal bodies of the heavens. He says that unlike fire, vital heat in animals, and the heat of the sun, their warmth preserves life, unlike fire. Not only is it semi-divine, it is also perhaps in a way immaterial and goes beyond the body, either by being the integrating principle of the multiplicity of organs and sensations and movements, or by having a depth that reaches into the eternal. It is this duplicity and complexity of pneuma that makes it intimately connected to a body, but also something more. The soul, psyche, both is and is not the same as pneuma. Aristotle draws out this ambiguity in the movement of animals. He says that all animals, quote, possess an inborn spirit, pneuma sum photon, and exercise their strength and virtue of it. This inborn spirit is used to explain desire, orexis. Desire is one of the most fundamental aspects of the animal soul, according to Aristotle. And it is classified by him as the central origin, or ton meson, middle term, which both moves and is itself moved. Aristotle furthers this idea of being a meson, a middle cause, middle term, or intermediary, by furnishing an very insightful metaphor of the movement of the elbow as it relates to the immobility of the shoulder. In this analogy, the shoulder is analogous to the immobility of the soul. The innate pneuma is likewise tethered to the soul. It's like the elbow. And with the elbow, a new sort of movement is made possible by being anchored at another point. Thus, the spirit is not the soul itself, but a sort of limb of the soul that helps it move and to act and increase its dexterity. And here we should think of the soul, the psyche, as being the deeper cause on the basis of which the pneumatic activity is made possible. And they are also intimately connected and should not be considered as separate entities. While Aristotle disambiguates them, he also uses them somewhat interchangeably. So we need to see a continuity between them. They imply both a similarity and a difference. He never says directly pneuma is the soul, but he directly describes the pneuma as psyche, meaning the inner strength or power of the soul preserving life. And now the same ambiguity between psyche and pneuma pertains to the famous distinction between entelikeia and energia, which are fundamental terms in the metaphysics. He draws out this particular distinction in De Anima, though, in book 2, where he says that the first actuality, the first entelikeia of the soul, is the deepest layer, the ultimate immovable principle of life. It is what preserves life and knowledge, like in the case of sleep and memory. There is another layer, though, a second actuality, as it was called by later commentators, which is actually activity, energia. And it's with this second layer that life shows its most primary form: mobility, dexterity, action, and thinking. In this sense, the psyche that preserves life relates to the pneuma of vital activity in exactly the same way that the entelikeia of the soul relates to the energia, that the actuality relates to the activity. The psyche, in that sense, is the proton entelikeia, as he calls it, the first actuality, meaning the most fundamental sense of actuality. The pneuma, on the other hand, is this living activity, energia. And if I had more time, I would go into way more detail on this and the complexities of it, but that's all I can say for now. We could say more in the Q&A, perhaps. So the pneuma as an innate spirit is something that grows together with the living body, animating it and directing it. The pneuma is not merely the glue of the body, it is what puts it in motion, restores it, and helps guide it to improve itself. It is the nature of this pneuma, he says, to be able to expand and contract. These transformations of the pneuma are among the primary works, erga, of the common sense. The inborn spirit causes movement in the body by expanding and contracting. Each of these implies not only a movement, but also a change in the degree of power and strength of the animal in its waking life. Quote, when it contracts, it is without force, and one and the same cause gives it force and enables it to thrust. These are the most fundamental transformations, modulations of the living activity of the pneuma, and they correspond to the extremes of strenuous effort on the one hand and sleep on the other. As it expands, the body is increasingly energized, and when it relaxes, it falls into a torpor. Thus, the pneuma intensifies and relaxes its energy by expanding and contracting. So the pneuma also explains the unity of experience and is equated with the common sense, as I mentioned in a couple of sections ago. The common sense for Aristotle is not exactly what we mean by common sense. It refers to a process and feature of perception that is common to all of the senses, but also, and more importantly, to the unity of experience that holds all of that multiplicity together. The common sense resides in the heart, as I said, which is relatively at the center of the body, and it gathers and makes sense of the manifold of phenomena. Touch, taste, smell, hearing, all of these are integrated into a coherent field of perception by the common sense. It acts as a middle term, mediating the diversity of movements and perceptions. The activity of the common sense corresponds directly with these increases and decreases of forcefulness of the pneuma and vital heat. Aristotle calls this wakefulness, egregoros, referring both to the alertness of being awake, something like the middle voice, and we don't use the middle voice in English, but if we did, it would say, I awaken myself, which sounds kind of strange, but also the passive voice, being awoken, aroused, or stirred. Wakefulness has this duplicity to it of being both active and passive. Wakefulness is characteristic of pneuma in its expanded state of intensity. And this is not a pure activity, but rather like a middle term or tension between activity and passivity. Wakefulness implies the awareness of sensations received from without and a self-awareness of feeling that one perceives, and as well, the fact that one is a source of motricity, kinetikon, a source of movement. The intensity of wakefulness unifies a multiplicity of sensations and behaviors and gives them a common intentionality. It gathers them in a way that lets the potentiality of the parts mutually augment each other, and the multitude of experience organizes into a whole that is more than the sum of the parts, and this introduces new causal properties. The common sense exercises authority over the body as a whole. It is that towards which the senses contribute, which the word here is syntainen, which means to converge, to contribute, but also to intensify by concentrating a multiplicity in a unity of participation. And this word is also connected to tonos. It is that which concentrates all the senses in a way which lets each contribute to a unified awareness and intentionality that none could achieve on their own. And likewise, when any of the organs is affected, each is affected by the others by a kind of sympathy. They feel something of what the others feel because of their interconnectivity. There is a sort of synesthetic power of spirit in this respect. But the common sense is ambiguous in another way. It is both a feature of the senses considered in and of themselves and in their combination. So it's something that arises in each sense, but more so something arises when they are gathered and integrated into one coherent whole. Now, what is common to all perception is that it involves awareness. Perception always implies that one is aware that they are hearing or seeing. Aristotle thinks that by the sheer fact that sleep affects all of our senses at once, that this is evidence that wakefulness is the active condition of the animal as a whole, which is centered again in the primary or common sense. And on a side note, this idea is quite close to what French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty thinks when he says the lived body or the body schema. And the same way that the common sense unifies a plurality of senses, in our experience, we unify a multitude of memories and they form a coherent whole, which Aristotle calls empyreia, experience. To be experienced means to have gained insight through trial and error, and to gain insight, you have to get your mind together, as Jimi Hendrix said in Are You Experienced? You must have a tension of alertness arise to bring coherence to it all. This arises from a tension in the pneuma that combines both activity and passivity. Each sense helps to strengthen and improve the ability of the others to operate. And no sense is purely passive. They all have some inner tension of their own that maintains their sensitivity. So living pneumatic activity concentrates itself and the world it experiences in order to form a sui generis whole that arises from the interaction of the plurality of the senses and the world it lives in. A whole that is beyond the parts emerges in the process of gaining experience. As a person has more and more new experiences, observes new details and complexities in the world, and stores it all up in their memory, at a certain moment, they put it all together, all of these observations fit together, and they see them in a higher order of organization. A kind of form arises. As someone gains more experiences, new skills, and knowledge, each new integration introduces new causal influences and unlocks new possibilities for that person's action. And Aristotle is very clear about this kind of developmental emergence in Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 1. The intensity of the whole, in this case, is greater than the sum of the ingredient tensions. But it is also, as Edgar Morin says, less than the sum of its parts, since the parts all involve a diversity of potentialities and are not all of these potentialities are harmonious with each other. Thank you, Dr. Kelly, again, for recommending this book to me. In order to form a whole, the parts have to be kept, all of the disharmonious parts of their potentials have to be kept in check. This same idea applies in the case of the sensitive organs of animals. Take the example of skin. Aristotle thinks that the flesh is a mixture of the basic elements, air, water, fire, earth. Now, if we take earth and fire and put them together, they're incompatible. They have a volatile and transformative relationship to each other. The fire burns and consumes the earthy bodies like wood. This is all explained in the generation and corruption and in the meteorology. So if we abstractly take them and try and put them together, they can't mix and unify. But in the flesh, they are mixed in a perfect proportionality. And by virtue of having this mixture and proportionality, the flesh is capable of perceiving heat, cold, dryness, and moisture. But in order to form this proportionate and harmonious mixture, the potential of the fire to burn the earth or of water to extinguish the fire need to be held in check. So the emergent unity of the flesh, just like that of experience as a whole, is both greater than the sum of its parts and also less than the sum of their potentiality. But it is by limiting the parts that new potentialities are unlocked, like the sensitivity of the flesh. And we already saw how the whole sensitive body is unified by the pneuma, and the pneuma itself is already a proportionate mixture of heat and moisture. And I think that Aristotle's biological concept of pneuma is actually far from being a sort of antiquated magical principle produced by an overactive imagination or superstition. It's actually quite close to what is now being described in quantum biology. In the right conditions, they say, and these conditions are always hot and moist, energy is circulated and made available for reorganization into higher forms of order, moving away from equilibrium into structures, and these unlock new possibilities not found in the parts. The energy and potential made available increases the indeterminacy necessary for emergence. Indeterminacy, which is essential to living activity, emerges in these unique conditions, and all sorts of possibilities arise that can't be explained through the mere mechanical laws of the material. This is roughly what Aristotle tried to explain, although he didn't have the resources to prove it in a rigorous way. So his theories have been recently discredited and laughed at, when in fact they are actually deeply insightful and based on observations. And I've said many times already that spirit is not merely a physical force, but is something that takes on very distinct qualities. And these qualities are global, holistic, and involve intelligence and intentionality. The intensity of spirit of pneuma is not merely a quantitative metric of tension. It involves a complex formal property as an organized whole. Aristotle named this aspect of life with his term Energia, being at work, which is the coordination of activity. And one way to understand this concretely is found in the phenomena of habituation. Aristotle reflected extensively on habit, its role in education, self-improvement, and the development of knowledge, as well as its propensity to sediment vices, harmful passions, and things like that. Habit is a way of shaping and attuning the soul. Aristotle sought to clear up this ambiguity in habit by distinguishing habits and customs, generally speaking, from more active and intentional types of habit, what we might call aptitude, adeptness, and skill. These habits he calls hexes. And along with all the skills we acquire in life, also things like health, which are ways that the soul directs and improves the body, are also called hexes. Hexes is therefore an important term needed to understand the living activity of pneuma. It is the way that pneuma improves and develops its powers in concrete ways of acting and thinking. Habit is also a type of unity among plurality. This is obvious in the case of coordinated movements. Many movements and modifications combined and compound. The multiplicity works together to form a unity that is greater than the sum of its parts. And virtues will build upon habits and put them together in a way that surpasses the parts considered in isolation. Now, this is the last thing I'm going to touch on. I meant to stop for questions, but I've just got one last little thing to say. I just want to mention this conception of spirit in the classic Athenian period that is very important for the Stoics, and that is this idea of tonos. So Socrates presented an ethical theory of the modes, the tonoi, in Republic Book 3. There he credits Damon, who was a 5th century music theorist who worked for Pericles, with the idea that each mode relates to a specific character trait or type of virtue. The tonoi, the modes, are basically different scales or patterns of notes. Socrates says, so we can think of like major and minor there. Socrates says that the Dorian mode suggests a stern and tempered character, the Phrygian, a severe and involuntary state of mind, Lydian, a relaxed and lethargic attitude, while Mixolydian is tyrannical, tormented, and lamenting. The voice and the mode somehow expresses the attitude, the intensity, and the character of the voice articulating it. And it also induces these feelings and states in the soul of the listener. And I've actually done a lot of work on reconstructing how the modes actually sounded in their proper tuning, and I'd be happy to share some of that with you in the Q&A if we have time. So Aristotle reiterates these same views in Politics 8:7, and he's mainly in agreement with the outlook of Republic, but he disagrees with the effects of Mixolydian and gives a more nuanced view in which Lydian plays a more prominent role due to its supposed healing and cathartic powers. Not only is music a language of human emotions and longings, it also helps attune and motivate our spirit to the work of self-improvement. It consoles the strains of our emotions and our sorrows, and it also gives us a way to express the harmonious effects of habit in someone whose actions are in agreement with themselves and whose actions help to improve their well-being. The proper attunement of pneuma describes the soul's success in ordering its life in a way that facilitates the flourishing of its potential. The Dorian mode, therefore, according to Socrates, is soul revealing. It shows us the most essential aspect of spirit, its most intimate nature. That is the voluntary, joyful striving for what is good, for improvement, for knowledge, and for beauty. We can neither be too relaxed or too high strung. We must balance out the tension and tune our spiritual energy. Therefore, we must tune our pneuma to the appropriate temperament, or else when we try to do good actions, when form good intentions, we will hit the wrong notes and act disharmoniously. This analogy is the main idea running through the ethics of both Plato and Aristotle. It blends the good, the beautiful, and simultaneously reveals the nature of the soul itself. Now, in the early Stoics, this topic of which would be for the next class, they use this idea of tonos, the tension of pneuma, as a basic cosmological principle that explains all physical and animate beings in nature. And all of these insights from both of them become essential to the spiritualism of Ravissant, which would be the later topic in the course. Okay.